Hi. We continue in 1 Samuel 15 today, looking at verses 22 to 26, as Samuel continues to push Saul to confess his sin, whatever exactly his sin is, which we'll look at in just a moment. So just to orient ourselves, we've been continuing, and now we're almost at the end of this long section from 1 Samuel 11 through 15, the basic reign of Saul here. And so we're on this last scene, and we've been working our way through it. We've also been comparing it to the passage in chapter 13, where Samuel confronted Saul first with the charge to wait 7 days and then offer sacrifice. And when he failed to wait the 7 days, or at least the exact moment for Samuel to return, he charged him with disobedience. And so as we've been looking at, I've color-coded the four parts of both of these the same way. The red was Samuel's command, the purple was Samuel's response, the blue with what Saul does under pressure, and the green Saul's defense. So in this section on the right side on the next page, we see there are two instances of Samuel's charges and Saul's defense, as coded by the purple and the green. Just one on this side. We've already looked at this one, and now we're looking, we looked at this part, and now we're looking at this part here. And this part here. So a couple of times that Samuel challenges Saul, and we'll see in this one, Saul will finally confess. But what exactly a sin is will not be clear, despite the many words around what it might be there. It's never ultimately clear, as we'll see. We've also been following these key words throughout the chapter, each key word color-coded, and we've been noting how in the section we're in here, the listening to the voice of Yahweh is the key thing, and centered here around the things devoted to destruction, the harem, the holy war command that began this back up here. So we're continuing to look at that issue here, and this time we're also looking, as we did last time, at how the question of listening to the voice throughout the Saul story and the question of sacrifice throughout the Saul story come together. So we noted last time how in the first issue, in chapter 8, when the question was the king was raised, Yahweh told Samuel many times to listen to the people, and he did. But now in our section, Samuel's word is to Saul is to listen to the voice of Yahweh in the purple here. And so we see that throughout, especially in this section right here that we're looking at today. But that overlaps also the question of sacrifice, because Samuel will make the question of obedience in contrast with the question of sacrifice, as we see in verse 22, which we'll look at in just a moment. And so what we began to look at last time, and we'll see more in a couple of videos when we get to chapter 16, is that while Samuel is suggesting that Yahweh does not have great delight in burnt offerings, Samuel was originally in charge of those very kinds of sacrifices, told Saul to go offer sacrifices when he sent him ahead to Gilgal. The people offered sacrifices, and nobody complained about that. And later Yahweh will tell Samuel to offer sacrifices as a cover story to protect him from what Samuel is afraid is the wrath of Saul preparing to kill him. So Yahweh does desire sacrifice, or at least accept sacrifice. And we're going to have to look more closely at the language of verse 22 and 23 in just a moment, which we will, to see exactly what's being said there. So let's look at this here, and I'm putting up here, and you can see on the screen, these two verses in poetic parallelism, as a number of scholars have noted here. This is a poetic response. It should be 22 here. I'll just correct it right here for the record. As Bodner notes, the genius of Samuel's indictment on the merits of what he says is that it does not matter whether Saul is bluffing, because paying attention is superior to sacrifice. So suddenly Samuel's speaking in poetic parallelism like the Psalms in four elements here. First, the question of comparing sacrifices with obedience. Then again, the question of obedience is better than sacrifice, and to heed the fat of rams. So he does that one twice. Then rebellion is no less a sin than divination, and stubbornness than iniquity and idolatry, and we'll look closely at those words in a minute. And then finally, the consequence for Saul: you have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king. He will not speak that way again in what follows, so it's interesting that the writers here have him suddenly speaking like a psalmist. David will speak like a psalmist, of course, later, and David is famously known as a psalmist himself, as writing the actual Psalms in the Hebrew Bible. We don't have to look at that question right now. But when it's a psalm from the mouth of David, as we'll see near the end, it actually is a whole psalm. Whereas here in the middle of a conversation, Samuel suddenly goes into psalmic poetic parallelism mode. So let's look a little more closely at the language of what he has here. First of all, there is no verb in the Hebrew for has here. It starts with, and Samuel said Yahweh, and it compares compares the word for great delight with that of obedience here. It's just a direct comparison. So the word for great delight, chafetz, here is a couple more times in 1 Samuel, but curiously, not ever in the Torah or in the Deuteronomistic history earlier, only in a couple passages in Kings, elsewhere in the Deuteronomistic history, and often in Isaiah. So it can be translated as delight or joy, and the question is that there's no question in the actual Hebrew. So it just simply juxtaposes Yahweh's great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, obeying the voice of Yahweh. So it's not clear as in the Hebrew as it seems to be in the English, that God does like sacrifices but prefers obedience to them. It's not clear that that's actually a comparison there in the original Hebrew. And is that Samuel's word or Yahweh's word? As we've looked at, there are a number of places in the prophets where we're told that Yahweh does not want sacrifices, but that's inconsistent with what we see both before and after the scene in our immediate context here. So we can't rely on the prophets for interpreting what's going on here. So the surely word here is henna, behold, drawing attention here. So Samuel says, behold, to listen, and I've been translating consistently as listen, as you can see over here. Listening is better than sacrifice, and to heed, using a different word here, kevesh here, as an adjective. It can mean literally to incline one's ears or attend to, so a synonym for listening, than the fat of rams. But again, the better is not clear. It's a comparative. It's tov once here, which is the word for good, but it's not a form that suggests it's a comparative. So simply putting those side by side and leaving the question open. And then here, this poetic parallelism here echoes Deuteronomy 31:27, putting rebellion and stubbornness together, as you can see right here. I know well how rebellious and stubborn you are, but it's a different word there for stubborn than it is here. So rebellion, and let's look at that. Mary here, only here in the Deuteronomistic history, other than the passage I just looked at, common in Ezekiel, because Ezekiel sees the whole exile as caused by the people's rebellion, primarily the leaders' rebellion, the bad shepherds who instead of caring for the sheep, eat the sheep. So Ezekiel characterizes rebellion against Yahweh among the leaders as the key sin that leads to exile. But there are very specific things that they do that seem to be causing harm to people, being selfish and not caring for the sheep. What exactly has Saul done that's not caring for the people or carrying out his role as king? That's not clear. So rebellion, no less a sin. So now he's speaking the language of sin. We see it a couple of times in this passage, and we saw that the Amalekites were described as sinners. So now this is equated with the sin. Then divination, which is wonderfully ironic in the later context here. Divination is prohibited in Deuteronomy 18, and as we've been seeing throughout this, it's not clear if readers of 1 Samuel 1 should know Deuteronomy, or whether Deuteronomy with Joshua were written much later in the monarchy at the time of King Josiah, as most scholars would say, a couple centuries later. But it's also, more importantly for our purpose, later in 1 Samuel, when Saul, desperate to find a way to contact Yahweh in the face of Yahweh's absence and David's growing, seeks to get a medium to call Samuel up from the dead, and he's successful in doing that. And then Samuel just says, "Why are you bothering me?" So Saul will engage in exactly divination, this behavior, which is clearly a sin, but that's not what's at issue right here, plainly. And stubbornness. Now, how has Saul been stubborn? The word petzer can also mean urged, and we don't see it earlier in the Deuteronomistic history, only in the 2 Kings a couple of times. As I noted, it was a different word in Deuteronomy 31 for stubborn there. But what exactly is being stubborn about Saul? What is it he's refusing to do, other than the fact that he let his people eat the animals that they gathered for spoil and refused to kill the king Agag? And it's compared here to inequity and idolatry, which I'd suggest, and many scholars have, including Falkelman here, that's a hendiadys, evil and idols, or the evil of teraphim here, of Ava and teraphim, rather than two separate things. So the word for evil, and the word translated idolatry, teraphim, refers specifically to the objects themselves. It's really not the word for the abstract notion of idolatry, but for the statues themselves. And that will come up also later in 1 Samuel, as we see here in 1 Samuel 19, where teraphim will be part of Mishal's plot to hide David's absence from Saul when Saul is chasing after him. So Saul will engage in divination, and Michal will not engage exactly in idolatry, but will use the objects of idolatry to fool her father. So both of these are proleptic, predicting what's going to be coming up soon. And then finally it ends like this. Notice that these are abstractions. We're now outside the question of King Agag and the Amalekites and the spoils of the cattle, etc. This is just an abstract theological discussion that Samuel is putting before Saul to get him to confess. But when Saul does confess in verse 24, again, we barely hear any specific content to it. It's really just, you're a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner. Okay, I'm a sinner already. But the consequence is that God is rejecting you. You have rejected the word of Yahweh, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king. Suggesting a sort of divine karma here, and we see that a number of times in the Bible and in this story too. And we'll see it again with David around the question of Uriah and his child in the next monarchy story. So we've already been told, Samuel's already told Saul that God has taken the monarchy away, but now he's just beating him up with it here. And as we start with Saul's reply here in verse 24, we note, just as we saw in 15 to 21, where Saul said the same thing at the beginning and the end, and it shaped a chiasm out of the section, so we also see this here in verse 24 to 31. We're only going to look at this first part today, but I'm putting this up on the screen so you can see how the themes that Saul names here about sinning and fearing the people, etc., will echo into the end, and the question of worship in the middle there. So Saul says to Samuel, I have sinned. He admits it here, and again, noting the repeat that forms the other side of the chiasm. Unlike David, though, Saul's sin is not forgotten. David's sin here in killing Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, is what he will acknowledge there. For I have transgressed the commandment. And the word for transgressed here is the Hebrew word, avarti. I've crossed over the commandment. So used ironically there, he was crossing over from another place, and now he's crossed into the land of iniquity, the land of evil, of the commandment of Yahweh. But literally here, the mouth of Yahweh, epi Yahweh. But again, what is it? And notice also that there's a question of, is it two separate things that Saul's separating? I've transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, raising the very issue that we've been exploring through the last couple of videos, is how much are Samuel's words Yahweh's words, and how much of the words that Samuel claims are Yahweh's words still Samuel's words. But another way to look at that here as, let's see, I think I have it here, as Falkeman does, is to see this as one thing. So he sees it as, I have transgressed God's command, which is identical to the words that you spoke to me. Saul too now equates God and prophet. So you can read it that way, as Falkeman does, as he's equating Samuel's words with God's words, or you can read it as they're separate. I've transgressed the commandment of Yahweh and your words. But perhaps there's some sarcasm on his part there, because why should he specifically listen to Samuel's words if they're not the words of Yahweh? Or if Yahweh hasn't commanded Saul to listen to Samuel's words, which we haven't heard. And the reason for it is he feared the people. As my note below says, just for me, the classic dilemma of the politician. And we see it again in Luke 2:22. Here is a specific example where the people that are challenging Jesus in Jerusalem are afraid of the people. And I'm sure you can consider many examples of that in U.S. political situations, fear of the base, or in whatever country and political context you're watching this, where politicians bluster but are often afraid of the very people upon whose own obedience and loyalty they depend for their own power. So I feared the people and listened to their voice, highlighting that alternative here, listening to their voice as opposed to the voice of Yahweh. So having gotten the confession out of Saul, Saul asked for weak punishment, or at least some kind of forgiveness. Now, therefore, I pray, he says here, but literally it's please. It's not the word for pray, it's not. So therefore, please pardon my sin, or literally lift or remove my sin here. It's only here as pardon in the 32 times in 1 Samuel. Other times it's simply ordinary lifting and such. But although most translations have pardon or forgive. But the literal image is to take it away, to lift or take off, unlike what we might hear in English for forgive. So remove my sin and return with me. Using one of our key words here 4 times in this section here, return. We see it in the orange here. So return with me so that I may worship the Lord. Why does Samuel want Saul to return with him? Well, almost certainly to have the authority of Samuel seen by the people there. The word for worship here is, again, a little key word in this section. I didn't highlight that as a key word because it's focused in the chiasm specifically, but it's the first time in 1 Samuel since chapter 2 when Eli was a priest and Samuel and Hannah and folks were around him as a context of worship. So finally for today, Samuel says to Saul, and almost verbatim from 23, "I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and Yahweh has rejected you from being king." So we see how it's parallel here, and perhaps we could have even shaped a little chiasm within that, but it's within the other chiasm, so it works either way. So that would seem to be the end of it, but as I was just highlighting, the chiasm goes on, and Samuel will engage in a symbolic act that Saul initiates to highlight, "It's all over for you, Saul," at least as far as Samuel's concerned. And we'll see where that goes in our text next time. See you then. Bye-bye.